My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the Director of the Institute for the Humanities here at SFU. It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to our film screening and panel discussion. The film is Fanon, Yesterday and Today by Hassane Mezine. I'll introduce the panelists in a little while when it comes time to have our discussion. But before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded, stolen territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish nations. Just a quick word about our format for this evening. This is working okay. What we're going to do is go fairly quickly to the screening of this amazing film that really spans the breadth and the depth of Fanon's life, from his birth to his death, and then his legacy, kind of the afterlife of Fanon, which has kind of regained its actuality today in a host of struggles throughout the world. After we do the screening, after we see this film, we're going to have Hassane beamed in via Skype. Hopefully all the technical aspects of that will work as per plan. He'll speak for about 15 to 20 minutes about the film. And then what I'd like us to have is just a short Q&A with the filmmaker. I think it's really a great opportunity to be able to talk about aspects of the film with him. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I think it'd be good to have about 10 minutes devoted to any questions or comments that people may have about the film or about the filmmaker himself. And then we'll have our panelists come up, I'll introduce them, and we'll get into a discussion of the film. So I think without any further ado, we should move forward. But one last thing, I would like to thank our partners here at the Van City Office for Community Engagement. We do an enormous amount of work with them and have done over the years. It's a tremendous pleasure. It's always great to come over to this building, to this space, in particular this theater. So thanks so much, Joe Hall, to Rachel as well, and Paige for all of your help in setting up the evening for tonight. So I think we should just proceed then to the screening. Okay, what a tour de force, an amazing film. And I think we're all now looking forward to hearing from Hassane about the film. And I think they're just going to be putting him up. And there he is. Hello, Hassane, welcome.
Hello everyone.
Congratulations on such a beautiful and important film.
Thank you very much.
Tremendously powerful. And so I think we should go straight to you now, and you have the floor now for the next 15-20 minutes. And as I said, we'd like to have a short Q&A after you finish, and then we'll proceed with our panel. So over to you.
Okay, so hello everyone. If you have any question, I could just answer any question. Maybe it's...
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Well, seeing as I've got the microphone, I'd like to ask you a question just to start things off. I think you've really, or the film really suggests a number of ways to understand the actuality of Fanon. The fact that, as Cornel West says, that most of us just are still sort of pre-Fanonian. We're trying to catch up with him. You present a number of ways of understanding that. What would you say is the crucial one? What crucial lesson is there for us today that we can learn from Fanon?
Yes, actually, what I tried to do by interviewing different people from different places was also to show the internationalism of Fanon. His, not only his Pan-Africanism, that is internationalism also, but to show that when Fanon was talking, especially in the 60s, that's when most of the quotes come from the wretched of the earth, it was a kind of warning us about what would happen if we were not careful enough and not being careful about looking after the revolution at all times. And we can see in today's world that finally his warning were very important, because we are into a very ultra-liberal world today, and we do see the results of his fear. And he was like at the vanguard of understanding the real danger of capitalism. And today we're right in it, and not only in the global south, but also in the global north as well, with all the thing that happened, with all the migration, with all the social changes that colonial history has brought even in the north. So to me that was kind of important to show that aspect of Fanon and his premonitions.
Indeed, and I think one of the ways in which capitalism has, in a sense, bolstered itself in its neoliberal phase is to really emphasize particularistic kinds of identities. You see this towards the latter part of the film in terms of divisions between sort of various South African indigenous communities and Nigerians, for example, or the Somalians. You see this worldwide with the rise of the far right. And one theme that seems to be coming back over and over again in the film is the need for a new kind of humanism. That is to say, capitalism is to be challenged not by going back to and reasserting particularistic kinds of identities, but rather by forging a new kind of humanism. I wonder if you'd like to say a few things about that, because that seemed to be a very, very powerful theme running through the film.
Yes, and I think that what Fanon was saying about that notion of nation state, that is a typical European nation state, that was a real mistake for the country being newly independent to copy-paste European type of nation states that brings to nationalism. And this is what we find now in, like what is happening in South Africa, or even I would say in North Africa today. The problem we have like between countries like Algeria and Morocco, having a border being closed for the last 20 years and having a kind of nationalism bringing new ideas of identities that were not the original one. We have these same people being separated by new notion of nationalism. And in Europe, this is what we're facing today with that, those identities being shaped, and having capitalism brings us into that failure. That failure going toward humanity, in the real sense of humanity. And today's, we can see that we're facing a crisis, economical crisis, and Europeans are just, I don't know how to express it properly, but there is like a real crispation on identity, and people just trying to keep their privilege. And by this, today we know that capitalism, has created races, and those races that were created, they had a purpose, and the purpose of domination. And this is not, we know that today, when we talk about races, we know this is a construction, and this construction was used to develop more exploitation of the South. And I don't know if I'm being clear or not.
Oh, very much so. No, thank you.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'd just like to open it up now for people, if they have questions, comments. if one or all of the panelists would like to pose a question or make a comment, I think this is a good opportunity. If you put your hand up, we'll get a microphone out to you. Yeah, please. Oh, you got it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. That was magnificent. I'm just so grateful I was here. A new kind of humanism, a new kind of internationalism. I guess I have, can you help me maybe get a sense of where Fanon's intuitions would be with the environmental crisis? I mean, rivers have intrinsic moral standing. Ecosystems, do they have intrinsic moral standing? Are they of the same value as a human? So how do we reconcile this even meta problem of the annihilation of all life for all time that Fanon wasn't privileged to foresee, I don't think? How do we reconcile a new kind of humanism, a new kind of internationalism with a new kind of eco-socialism? I don't know.
Excellent question. Now, do we have others? And we maybe take a batch of, say, 3 questions at a time. Are there other questions or not at this? Oh, right there. Yeah, there are a couple of others. So let's have 3 and then Hassane can respond to all of them.
Oh, hi. Est-ce que je peux demander ma question en français?
Bien sûr.
Alors, ma question était, j'étais très intéressé par une des dames qui a parlé de la colère de Fanon. Et ma question est, je crois qu'aujourd'hui, on voit quelque chose de nouveau, c'est une colère dans la droite politique, et une colère qu'on n'a pas vue précédente. Je crois qu'auparavant, on a vu peut-être un racisme, paternalisme, subjugation, mais aujourd'hui on voit une colère qu'on voit en Inde, au Royaume-Uni, États-Unis. Et alors ma question est, quel est le potentiel productif de la colère de Fanon face à la colère de la droite qu'on voit aujourd'hui?
Thank you.
Merci.
And one more.
There's a request that you what's the productive potential of Fanon's anger, the emotional, the manifested anger, when it's faced with the kind of anger that we see in the right of politics today, that an anger that maybe we didn't see previously, that maybe before was racism or subjugation or paternalism, but today is anger, and you see it in India, the UK, and USA. So how do we, what's the productive potential of Fanon's anger when today there's an anger on the right?
Excellent. And a third, and then we can go back to the sun.
Bonsoir et salam alaikum.
Salam, bonsoir.
I've just come from many years working and living in Liberia, also in Haiti. So when your movie at some points touches on the multi-ethnicity within Africa, and then there's a one united Africa, and then there's the creation of a nation state which actually destroys the peoples, really. I was wondering if, well, I imagine that you have coming up a new project, un projet qui arrive bientôt, because it just seems, maybe I was reading between the lines, but it just seems to me that there's a continuity or continuation of this movie that's necessary, that draws on those threads. So multi-ethnic, pluriethnic, all of that in face of the nation-state building which destroys us.
Okay, great. Back to you, Hassane.
Okay, thank you for the question. So I think the 3 questions are very linked, actually, in the way that we're talking about what capitalism brings, and this is actually what we're facing today. When Fanon was talking about the anger he had, it was because we were like in a time that was different of today. We were in a time where we had still maybe a balance, when there still used to be the USSR and the Western blocs, and the Third World was like a newly born and was trying to go in between those 2 blocks. Today we're facing a different reality as well. And it is it's very important to understand that when we think of Fanon, we have to applying at all time. We have to be creative at all time and applying in different eras, and to update him as well in today's world. And linked to the first question of the lady, I think yes. Today, when we talk about Fanon, there is something that is very central, is the question of alienation. And when we talk about alienation today, we have to link it to the question of privilege. And what does that mean? That means that if we are really looking for justice that would be between all humans, justice that would be environmental also, we have to be aware, especially in the North, that we are living on the back of the South. And as long as we just live on the back of the South and it doesn't give us any moral and political problems, it means that we are very glad in keeping our privilege of living in the North. And I think this is maybe one of the first things that needs to be thought for us living in the global North, and looking to see how we can maybe level things with the South. We know that today all the environmental problems that we have in the North, we start talking about them, but we are the one who have produced them. And the people that suffer the more about all the industrial massacres that were done in the world, they are people living in the South. And so I think the question of, to think about the question of privilege is very central, and is part of the question of alienation. When we talk about, when Fanon talks about alienation, it's not only by people living as dominies in the world, but it's also people who have the privilege, that are alienated to their privilege. And we have to think about this. So maybe this is a way to go toward justice, and maybe to go toward more like mutual human respect. So concerning the, I don't remember the second question.
Question about anger?
Yes, about anger. I think the anger is very present because, yes, I mean, daily material things make us being into anger, and we have to, and things are not getting better. So how can I put it? I know the lady who is talking about this, it's, I think, the lady in Algeria, Salim Arzali. And just for information, this lady was interviewed 2 years ago, which means like almost a year and a half before the starting of the revolution, the 22nd of last February. So when she was talking about how anger had to be brought into a political tool and not becoming just violence for violence, as we usually try to discredit Fanon using the concept of violence as if Fanon was talking about being violent just to be violent. It's not the end of the thing. And today, anger can become something very important to bring it like a peaceful demonstration. When violence is not being needed, it's not needed. And those things are now coming from the South, and they're giving a lesson to the North at the moment. And I think that this is very important because the South is just has enough with violence. And now if you can't have alternatives with anger to bring it in something peaceful, means that violence will be present when it's needed, but when it's not needed, other ways of protesting and struggling are present. And concerning the movie and maybe the extension of the movie, I think, yes, the subject is very open, and I think it is very good that anyone can try to do something and carry on this work. Actually, it's not finished, and this is not the artistic work. I mean, to me, I don't consider myself as an artist at all. I mean, to me, it's more doing some activist work and finding a way through movie to maybe to do some popular education. And I think this work can be carried on by anyone, maybe in the same way with a different angle. But yes.
Well, thank you very much. Hassane, a quick question. Are you able to remain with us, or I know it's very late where you are. It's something like 4 a.m, isn't it? We thought we might let you go and get some sleep, but I don't know what your preference is. Would you like to stay with us as we have our panel discussion, or would you like to retire?
No, I don't mind staying and listening. I'm sure there's plenty of interesting things to be said.
Well, wonderful. We're very happy to have you. So I think we should then have our panelists come up. I'll briefly introduce them. They have a few things prepared to say, and then we'll continue on with our discussion. Second to my left, we have Glenn Coulthart, who is Welede Dene and an associate professor in First Nations and Indigenous in the Indigenous Studies program in the Department of Political Science at UBC. His book, which I'm sure you all know by now, Red Skin, White Masks, published in 2014 by the University of Minnesota Press, was awarded the Caribbean Philosophical Association Frantz Fanon Award for Most Outstanding Book in 2016. He teaches political theory and indigenous politics. To my immediate left is Jaleh Mansour, whose current project traces the historical and structural entwinement of aesthetic and real or concrete abstraction, the latter understood as the extraction of labor power valorized by transactional exchange on the market through the conception of time to offer a comprehensive account of the dissolution of 20th century aesthetic abstraction, turn to social practice art and advent of post-humanism. An associate professor of art history at UBC, Mansour's areas of teaching and research include modernism and the avant-garde, European art since 1945, Marxism, the Frankfurt School, formalism, Marxist feminism, and social reproduction theory. And last but not least, Zobi Al-Zobaidi, who's a restaurateur, a novelist, poet, and independent filmmaker in his own right, currently working on his doctorate here at SFU. Zobi was born in Jerusalem, raised in Jalazon refugee camp near Ramallah, and educated at Birzeit University in Palestine and New York University in the United States. His films address the realities and complexities of contemporary Palestinian life, the disruptions and humiliations of everyday existence lived under Israeli occupation in the refugee camps and in the troubled enclaves of the West Bank, the West Bank and Gaza, and the internal fragmentation and divisions that afflict Palestinian society. So I'm going to turn it over to Glenn now for a few comments.
Thank you, Samir, and thanks for everybody for coming. And mostly thank you to our filmmaker. I had a chance to watch it once before, but this was the first time that I really got to kind of gauge the film also vis-a-vis people's reaction, which I think is a really important aspect of the film. I think what I appreciated most about the film, as somebody who has been forced to dabble in what in the academy has become known as Fanon studies, is it really kind of produces it humanizes the person that Fanon was, and it does so in a way that other biographical accounts, both written and or in film, have yet to truly succeed. So I love the aspect of hearing about grumpy Fanon vis-a-vis the French, but also joyous Christmas Eve Fanon was a really awesome part to learn about. But more importantly, I think it really just also got at the way in which, or the effective draw that Fanon as a person, as a theorist and an activist, impacts people on a global scale. So there's a lot of work that's been kind of spilled and poured into detailing in specificity what Fanon says, what he could have meant. There's a certain debates over an ownership of his ideas, and what this film does better than any that I've seen is that it really kind of positions Fanon as a global thinker with global relevance. Relevance that isn't limited to the kind of the immediate, the moment which he characterized like from the apioth, the kind of the the joyous sort of victory of liberty to the tyranny of a post-colonial dependency. It just shows his consistency and his insight through time. So I've really kind of taken this in my own work to try and apply it in ways that I think that the film actually helps me think through, is that in Fanon's day, he's thinking through a relationship between the colonial metropole and the colonized territory, and thinking through the structural and psychoaffective ways in which that relationship is maintained, even in the context of formal independence. And what this film does is shows his relevance after that relationship between metropole and colonial territory, or global south and global north, is internalized within the capitalist, still profoundly racist, white supremacist structures and states of the global north. So it really kind of shows how that dynamic is now internalized within France. Through Brother Cornel West's, I wish I could just say I disagree with Cornel West, but through Cornel West's kind of understanding is like his theory of kind of colonial relationship is also perhaps even more relevant, I think, in the context of settler states like Canada, and I've tried to make that argument to varying degrees of success, and especially it's because of the very specific attention and detailed attention he pays to the ways in which our subjectivities are shaped to which blunt the violence of the relationship itself. And you would think, like, in a context of France versus Algeria, that kind of subjectivization is less important because what's doing most of the work is just straight pure violence. But in the context of settler colonies or colonial race relationships in places like France, which claim or have established rights regimes in them, it's really kind of the ways in which our identities are shaped that prop up that regime in liberal rights contexts. And I think that the movie, Better Than Any, that I've seen really demonstrates the relevance of Fanon in the global north. The other thing is that we can come to this in a detached sort of scholarly way, like what is Fanon's socio-diagnostic of these relationships and what's its relevance here, but the film doesn't do that. The film is based off of kind of the affect that Fanon as a thinker, Fanon as a phenomenologist, Fanon as a theorist that thinks through problematics from the lived experience, really has an impact on all these folks, whether it's collegial or in terms of activism. And that's the first way that Fanon popped out at me. Wasn't like, oh, I think that his critique of Hegel has something to say to liberal multiculturalism in Canada and Indigenous people's position in that. It was like, as a colonized subject, that voice spoke to me. It screamed in my ear. It says, you're not the problem here, they are. And then that kind of unbroke that dialectic that allowed me to start to see more of the kind of theoretical sophistication in his work. And I really saw that pop in this. It was these people's, the people who were interviewed were not just like Fanon is a really astute theoretician of the colonial relationship, but that has to be grounded in and born out of a spirited practice. And I think that's what I probably will take away most from the film. So I just want to say, Masi Cho, thank you for a wonderful film.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. I think that this whole question of the spatial relations of colonialism probably come back in the discussion somehow. It's just an inkling I have. So we'll turn it over then to Jaleh.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I'm trying to think about how to wrap this all together as swiftly as possible in the interest of time. The film has indubitably many strengths and is absolutely necessary to our global context at present. I think I'll just try and draw out what kinds of immediate use value it might have to a social cultural historian such as myself. So having worked on autonomia in the Italian context, I know that one of the most difficult things to try and communicate to the interlocutor, wherever on the globe the interlocutor might be, is that there is this phenomenon, the settler colonial apparatus, which operates through a series of socially determinative mechanisms that are similar across geopolitical locale. And for the classically trained social historian of culture, there's always the need to return to context, context, context. And so I think one of the most brilliant elements of this film is the emphasis of mechanisms across place and time over anchoring politics in context. I can't thank this filmmaker enough for doing a very difficult kind of intellectual labor with great efficiency and elegance. Another great strength is the way in which it makes the case for how settler colonialism is not winding down in contemporaneity, but is in fact really just beginning, really amping up, but through means other to the ones that we have come to recognize. So global settler colonialism isn't going to look the way it did in the 19th century. It's not necessarily about weaponry and tanks and boots on the ground, but it operates through an economic register, the World Bank, the IMF, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm tremendously grateful for the kind of fuel this film has afforded a scholar like me of instances of autonomia in different geopolitical contexts, even though I've previously worked in the Italian context. If I were to turn to, for instance, page 69 of The Wretched of the Earth, the way that set of mechanisms is described could just as well be describing the transition of the peasantry from southern Italy to Fiat and other car manufacturing places in northern Italy in the 60s. So it's a description of how colonialism is not exclusively in the quote-unquote third world, but is everywhere all the time. It can be found where capital can be found. So I hope I've made abundantly clear just how important I think this film is on numerous registers. Now, if I may, my criticism of the film, and I couldn't have known what Glenn was going to say tonight, so this is by no means pre-planned or scripted, or my criticism of the film might disagree with Glenn's remarks in that I wish the film had spent a little bit more time recognizing the degree to which Fanon's political project is rooted and anchored in a very rarefied, tremendously brilliant intellectual project, which comes from psychoanalysis and can be traced, through Lacan, through Kojève, and indeed Hegel, but we don't need to go into the umpteenth critique of the phenomenology. I think that in order to emphasize the value of the film to contemporaneity, it would be useful in introducing it to make a case for Fanon's own training in psychoanalysis and the way in which the subject is formed by internalizing those mechanisms that determine and structure the exterior field, that those mechanisms are internalized. And in order for the project of decolonialization to happen, the subject must first decolonize herself or himself. And that comes across in a number of the figures who speak in part 2 of the film, specifically the psychiatrist in Palestine, where she talks about the problem of mimicry. But I think had the film just taken out 7 to 8, 9 minutes to further explore that problematic, it would give us a better sense of what it means to decolonize now. I think we all know by now that you cannot put a black man in the White House and expect anything to change overnight, and that the project of decolonization, whatever decolonize this in New York City might have to say about it with their t-shirts and their stickers, and it's not something that can be reduced to symbolism and pageantry. It's a very difficult process of dismantling existing social structures and social relations. And in order to do that, the subject isn't sort of going to forge forth and just begin accomplishing that without first taking the self to task insofar as the self has become, in many ways, I know we all like to think that the subject is opaque, etc. Sure. But in many ways, the symptoms that constitute the self are transparent to external mechanisms, structure, social relations, etc., etc. So I don't want to call this a weakness of the film necessarily. I think it's implicit and it comes across. But I think just a few more moments of attending to the psychoanalytic project would give us a sense of what we have in mind and what we're up against, and the tools that we need to mobilize in order to enact any kind of decolonization that will be, again, not just symbolism and pageantry. So I think I've made myself pretty clear, and there's no reason to just keep hammering the point. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jolie.
Thank you.
I think also Jolie's remarks could have been construed, or could be construed, as a kind of continuation of the conversation sparked by that third question. You know, what comes next, and what kinds of discussions will follow from this. I also think that this discussion of finance and the role of banking in neocolonialism today is important, because Thomas Sankara appears in the protests in South Africa, and I think this is so important. His understanding of the role of debt in the subordination of Africa, and the other thing that's quite important is we had, and I meant to point this out at the beginning of our evening. We had just a couple of weeks ago the brilliant Kenyan novelist and now poet Ngugi speak about the whole problematic of decolonizing the mind, and central to that, and this what really puts him in conversation with resurgent indigenous politics, is his emphasis on language, symbolic order, right? And what he did was he recited poetry in Gikuyu, and then there was a translation in Italian and in English. It was quite brilliant. So I think thinking those two together is really important: debt and the symbolic order. Sobi, over to you.
Hello, is this working? Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate this film and many, because I know how difficult it is to make a documentary film about an intellectual. It's like Frantz Fanon. And I also I appreciate the film because it's the way it connects different parts and different struggles in the world. Something that is very much needed. Especially, I am always speaking from the position of a Palestinian refugee, a colonized subject, who's aware of being colonized and who spent his life in every way struggling against this colonization, struggling to maintain my sense of identity and orientation in the world, and despite of this violent machine, the Zionist machine, that is continuously, non-stop working to sort of demolish the sense of identity that I have. So anytime there is a link between Palestinian struggle and any other struggle, indigenous struggle, South Africa and Africa, any part of the world, I feel it empowers us, and it empowers all those who are fighting against colonization, fighting against imperialism. So I think this work is really important in that it's a great contribution to this project. I was actually, when I was watching the film, like at some point, I was hoping or I was expecting to see a segment that focuses on indigenous people in North America. And I think I want to turn to Hassane, if he doesn't mind, and ask him, have you, like, did you think, why did you not include, for example, like a segment about the struggle of indigenous people here in North America?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Thank you very much. Actually, I think the most difficult thing during the making of this film was the choice of the people I would interview because of some financial reasons. To give you an idea, this movie was made with a budget of $15,000, 15. So the whole movie, including the post-production as well. And this is through a crowdfunding that I did direct that movie to keep a full independence. And it's true that I would have loved to include the northern part of the Americas, and I would have loved to include Brazil as well, the question of coloniality in Brazil. And I think I would have loved to include the question in India today, the matter of coloniality, and even maybe Sri Lanka as well, how the impact of Fanon among the Sri Lankan people, the Tamil Tigers, was to influence. Why not Iran as well, when we talk about the link that Fanon had with Ali Shariati? And finally, I had to stop dreaming, and I just realized that I had such a budget, and I had to do with to be very pragmatic in the way I would work. But it's true that having North America and the question of the natives in North America would have been very, very important in the movie. And I just want to say one thing also about what the lady said just before concerning the question of developing more the idea of Fanon, and I totally agree. But I think this movie is also an introduction to Fanon. And this is not like a movie for people that know Fanon very well. And the thing is, I see today that many people don't know Fanon and discover him. And the only pretension of the movie is to have Fanon being discovered and people to buy his books and to read them and make an idea by themselves as well, and to develop their knowledge about what Fanon brings and what the ideas of justice and humanism is bringing. So, but your point was very good. Actually, it's I think it could be, as Samir said, that maybe the third part of the movie.
Thank you, Hassane.
Thank you.
The other point that I like to sort of raise for discussion is that not only from this film, like sort of really emphasized or stressed my own personal understanding of Fanon, which I found. One thing I learned, like what really I learned from Fanon, is that identity is fluid, and I think it's fluid. By identity, and I think like sometimes we use the word identity, and maybe the way I use it and the way you hear it, you have a certain understanding, but it doesn't mean that we both have the same understanding of the term identity. There are many ways to understand it. Now, my understanding of identity, I want to use a metaphor. It helps me to explain how I understand identity. Now, there is a scaffolding. When a building is being built, there is a scaffolding around the building. And when the building is finished, the scaffolding is gone. Where I grew up, like many times, I was taught that identity is the building, the finished building, and that's it. However, after, in life I learned that identity is the scaffolding around the building. It's not the finished building. Identity is a project in making. Identity is a production. And it is never a finished project. Identity, scaffolding disappears when the building is finished. And this is the ideological attempt at fixing identity at a certain understanding. Identity means this, period. While a scaffolding, you never know what's going to happen to it. It's just a work in progress. And I think one of the things I learned from Fanon is that he really taught me that identity is a scaffolding. Identity is a work in progress. Once identity is finished, that's when you start to fight against that notion of identity. And I think the film really illustrated this notion from South Africa to the United States, to Niger, to Algeria, to Palestine. Everybody has a different interpretation, a different articulation of the notion of identity and how in their milieu, in their private or specific circumstances, Fanon or the notion of identity means this, means we have to do this. Different interpretations, different articulations of it in different places. Yeah, that's.
Thank you, Sylvie. That's a wonderful way of understanding identity and fully in keeping with the kind of Sartrean understanding that underwrites, I think, Fanon's. The idea of identity as a project, as a projection, as something that's always already incomplete. Yeah. And maybe we could say that the difference between a kind of revolutionary identity, the one that's always understood to be a project, a political one, and the idea of the pitfalls of national consciousness is that the revolutionary one really has this scaffold idea, whereas the one of the national bourgeoisie is one of a finished building, which then can also be occupied and deployed against the people. And I think this is a real...
The religious notion of identity is the finished building. A nationalist notion of identity is a finished building.
Yeah,
and certain people can go in it, not everybody.
That's right.
A religious, Christian or Muslim or Jewish religious notion of identity, like the Jewish state Israel. For those Jews, like it's a Jewish.
Keep the microphone close.
It's a Jewish state. Yeah. So everyone else is excluded, although we live in the same country. We Palestinians live in the same country. But no, we're excluded. So, whereas, like, for example, me as a Palestinian activist, I call for a certain notion of identity that includes Jews and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians, because I have this understanding of identity as an unfinished project, whereas, like, Zionist Jews will believe that no, it's the finished building. So that's really the difference, and I think understanding, sort of facilitating identity and starting to sort of understand it this way really helps us to. It becomes more inclusive, more malleable, less fascist, hopefully.
I mean, you're really talking about the architecture of power, right? The architecture of power, which is central to fascism. Good, so why don't we open it up? We have about, in fact, we have exactly 30 minutes for questions and or comments. So people should just feel free to put your hands up and we'll send a microphone out to you. And you're most free also to keep directing questions and comments towards Hassane. Take advantage of the fact that he's still with us, and this is wonderful.
Hi, thank you very much to the filmmaker and to the panelists and the host for this evening. I'm interested in the tension between the kind of nationalist interpretation of Fanon and the internationalist one. And the kind of, my interest especially is in how Fanon is almost like a litmus test for people's politics. You know, like there's, people cherry pick Fanon, like, oh, I want this part of Fanon and not taking the entire analysis into account. And especially the progression of his analysis from the 50s to the 1960s. I think I also really appreciated the fact that the film focused so much on today's world and what decolonization actually looks like today versus what we thought it looked like in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And it's this tension again between nationalism and internationalism. So is Fanon, and I'm asking this of the filmmaker and the panelist, is Fanon's concern about the hijacking of the Liberation Project something that the quote-unquote national bourgeoisie accomplished? Or is it actually that the logics of posing liberation as a national project already ensured that it would be hijacked because it failed to take into account that capitalism was global, never mind today. And I think that's one of the limitations, I think, of the analysis in the film. It's not just today that capitalism is global. It's been global for a very, very long time, and it was certainly global in Fanon's day and long before that. So if capitalism was global when Fanon was alive, and when certainly when we are alive, how do we then square up this idea that the problem was the national bourgeoisie rather than the problem was that liberation was imagined as national in the first place?
Thank you. Excellent question. Back there.
Well, that was a really good question. I'm a little nervous to go after that. So the first thing, thank you to everyone. And it's really interesting because I actually didn't see a dichotomy between what Jale and Glenn said. I actually think that the two can come together. I think that the film being grounded in lived experience is really important, and it makes it very accessible. However, I almost think, like afterwards, there can be, like what Jale suggested. My question actually surrounded, there was quite a lot of talk at the beginning about humanism, and I wondered if you could speak about how such projects wouldn't just immediately be co-opted by the white supremacist project. I'm thinking very much about how, for example, Black Lives Matter, immediately people start saying, no, all lives matter, and how these projects do kind of bring everyone together, ultimately make people that are colonized subjects worse off. And my second question just surrounded actually kind of Fanon's psychoanalysis and psychiatry, because I've seen a rise in right-wing, well, I hesitate to call it scholarship, but it's essentially suggesting that different like IQ levels, and it's kind of returning back to eugenics. So we're seeing a resurfacing of that. And I'm wondering if you could speak about how we can use Fanon, or do we need something else?
Thank you. Excellent question. And do we have a third? I thought I saw another hand up. If not, I think we can address the questions then. Who would like to take a stab at this? Hassane, would you like to go first, or shall I?
Yeah, maybe very quickly.
Okay.
Actually, I think, the first question was very important, because when we talk about the national bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, it's a tool of the counter-revolution, and I think people that were spotted already by colonialists to become that national bourgeoisie, they were, I think, they were studied, and I think the psychological profile was studied to see if these people were ready to betray everything. And actually, yes, and they were ready to betray a revolution. And they played a very important role. And when we talk about the national project into internationalism, yes, I think when we talk about the South, the nationalism in the South is very different from the nationalism in the North. This is not a reactionary nationalism. This is a nationalism of liberation, and it has to be seen through a very different prism. And yes, this national bourgeoisie has played a very nasty role in helping the counter-revolution to try to fail the project of a common liberation. I think Fanon was very aware of this, because when he talks in 60 about this, he can see already the newly independent Tunisia and Morocco from 56, or the West African countries being independent in 1960, and seeing all the mechanism of what we call today, for example, France-Afrique, with all the mechanism of neocolonialism being set it in the country, and all the psychological aspect, and all the question of alienation that is still very central in this. So yeah, maybe let's...
Thank you. So Jaleh?
Sure. To the first question, there's a moment early in the film where we hear Fanon's voice, and he says something like da-da-da-da-da, l'homme, c'est-à-dire moi-même. So he is taking possession and ownership of this abstraction, this universal notion of man, by placing it in the first person pronoun I, in a very interesting way that I think then responds to the second question of what kind of universalism is being posited here, and can we slide from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter and Cops Lives Matter? I don't think so, because there's a model of universalism that's positing the subject of history. And this is what, when you read Wretched of the Earth, it sort of has this in common with Lukács. The subject of history that is the subject position that is the most exploited and oppressed, and has to dialectically overturn this. So I think no matter how much jiu-jitsu one were to do as an academic or an intellectual, it would be impossible to conclude that all lives matter based on, this l'homme, c'est-à-dire moi-même, enchained, who is the driving force of a model of history which, for better or worse, is a Hegelian model of history. So that would be how I would try to answer that. I defer.
A couple of questions. One is like Jaleh's psychoanalytic intervention. I've tended to avoid that and kind of take insights from Fanon's kind of anti-racist Marxism, I guess is. So he has got this kind of really interesting intervention into the relationship between structure and agency, or how it was talked about in these circles as kind of base and superstructure. And the problem with decolonization in either like what has been termed, like understood as the superstructure or ideational realm versus the material or base realm, is that they don't exist in a kind of directly causal relationship. So you can still, and this is what he means by, like, we have to struggle with a war on two levels in Black Skin, White Mass, is we have to transform the subjectivities so at the ideational or cultural level, because you can still live a colonized existence even though there might be some change in the structure, and vice versa. So his critique of negritude was the vice versa. It's like you can kind of work over one's subjectivities towards decolonial ends through revitalization of language language, which would be a good example. But if that isn't somehow kind of related to some change in the structure that's producing colonized subjectivities to begin with, then we're at a standstill again. So I think like whether or not you get it through the insights that he has from as a psychiatrist, or the insights that he has as kind of as a Marxish sort of thinker, you still get to the same conclusion, and we have to transform both.
But this wonderful expression of the epidermalization of inequality, right? It's a mistaking or transference of cause and effect, and I think that's a brilliant aspect of his analysis.
The other question, the nationalism question, it's interesting because Nandita's question was the question posed, or the critique posed, by Pierre Elliott Trudeau to the Quebec sovereigntists. He called them cherry pickers. He says, you don't read Fanon, you only read the first chapter on violence, and you fail to see his insight in its whole, and especially as a critique of nationalism. And that's all interesting, but the problem is, I think a Fanonian analysis would understand to what ends are certain identity, or like articulations or politics around identity serving, and is that what they said, a robust international understanding of freedom. So whether or not the end takes this form, what we should be concerned with is its effects. And then that is also the way in which we should frame our critiques of nationalism, is not just writ large a priori. It's like, what ways and to what ends is this understanding of identity and its claims serving a free, collectively free life. So when we're talking about identity here, and then Samir is like, well, yeah, that really gets at like the questions of power. I'm like, yes, it is questions of power that we should be concerning ourselves with. And insofar as various articulations of identity are serving power relationships of violence, and that we're reproducing death promoted in xenophobic and racist ideologies, then yes, obviously that deserves our critique. But not just writ large, or else that was what Trudeau was doing in critiquing both the sovereigntists and then eventually indigenous peoples, in order to hold up, or at least fail to critique, the colonial relations of power that structure this place in the present.
Thanks, Glenn. Wonderful, yeah. Yeah, I mean, just further to that, we're living in a historical moment today where a minister in the BJP government in India declares that Western human rights don't apply in India, and this authorizes then the worst kinds of Islamophobia, and reinforces various forms of caste domination as well. You have a situation as well in Uganda where a similar logic is at play. You know, homosexuality is an export from the West, which justifies what? Capital punishment. Now, this is absolutely brutal, and you can see the way in which identity here serves particular forms of power, and I think that also goes to the question. Yes, we have to be very careful about how abstract forms of universalism, abstract forms of humanism, are deployed in ways that undermine movements like Black Lives Matter. But at the same time, if we would retreat from what Atu Seshiotu is a very important Fanon scholar. I think he's written probably one of the best books, next to Glenn's, of course, on Fanon, which is Fanon's Dialectic of Experience. He's come out with a book recently called Left Universalism, Africa-centric essays, where he retrieves the idea of the human. He retrieves the idea of a kind of concrete universal. He retrieves the idea of individuality. And he says, these things cannot be left to Europe. It cannot be simply understood. These ideas cannot be simply understood as being reduced to Eurocentrism. And I think this is an argument worth paying attention to. So that would be a good place to go next, if you're interested. Sobi, response?
Just I think you guys answered both questions. But the first question about nationalism and internationalism and the hijacking. But I also would warn that I would add to what Hassane said about nationalism in the South is different from nationalism in the North. But also nationalism for a colonized group or a colonized country is also different from the same notion or what it serves in a non-colonized, even if they were both in the South or in the North. So what I would suggest also is that my own understanding of I'll tell you, for example, my own. I'm of course Palestinian. I'm personally fighting for an independent, not independent Palestinian state with a Palestinian flag and a Palestinian passport. I don't really care about those things now. If you asked me 20, 30 years ago, I would tell you, I would die carrying the Palestinian flag, but now I don't. I don't really die just for the Palestinian flag. I'm more practical, and I want to live in a country where I live equal with everyone else. So it is not really a nationalistically driven struggle, the one I have now. It is a lot more than nationalistic. Or if I would use the word nationalism, it will take me to areas that will sort of mystify a great deal of what I want to do in life. So I would be cautious when I use nationalism to describe struggle, especially in places where there is still colonial struggle. It's really it describes a good deal of what people, their aspirations, but it mystifies a great deal of their potential.
All right, I think we have time for another round. So any others? Any other questions, comments? Maybe while people are formulating questions. Oh.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting looking at the news these days about Rojava or Ecuador, what's going on in those locations, how communities that had the option to sort of fall back on these ideas of nationalism as a means for their liberation struggle aren't. And they've actually chosen much more complex forms of liberatory sort of conversation to engage in terms of being against neoliberalism or being against these the nation states having their cat's paws in the Middle East or whatnot. So if any of you folks want to respond to that.
Well, the feminist content of Rojava is also really, really crucial. Shouldn't leave that out. But yeah, excellent question. Do we have others that we want to take up? Yes, back there. And then if there aren't any others who haven't actually been able to pose a question yet, we can come back to you if you like to ask a second question. So please.
I want to ask Hassane about the relevance of the non-aligned movement and what other institutions exist internationally for people of color that draw kind of international solidarity and make the links between our different struggles and movements, and is that the one organization, or if there are other groups that are kind of providing an outside option of the United Nations, because we know the United Nations does not represent people of color or people of the South in any way. It's a tool of imperialist power. So if not the United Nations, then what is our international avenue for change?
Good, thank you. And then you can come here. Yes, if you'd like to go again.
Actually, our dear friend from Palestine, you clarified my question, the question I would have had, so I'm really relieved. I was getting confused with your talk about identity and nationalism. So thank you for clarifying it. And I'll do another question instead, which is very operational. But Hassane, I think that your documentary is meant to be spread far and wide. I'm already thinking of my 28-year-old kids who have to see it, and they have to spread it out to others. Are we going to do something about disseminating it further so that it actually impacts and is an activist tool?
That's a very good
posing
question.
it as a question to all of us.
Thank you. So back to the panel. Hassane, why don't you go first?
Yes, so yes, actually concerning the last question, yes, actually the movie will be available, I think during 2020, because actually now it's just a question of rights issues and commercial issues and things that need to be dealt to be able to do DVDs and stuff like that. It takes a little of time, but the thing is that this movie, I want it to be actually distributed and to go to, if it can go to schools and in different places, not only in the academia. And of course, this is the purpose of this movie. So it will take like a few months' time, but it will be ready. And I think through Samir and Simon Fraser Institute, they will be aware of this. I'll let them know. And concerning the first question that was linked to the international link that needs to be done, there is actually a lot of work to be done. Because, I would take the case of, as an example, the case of Algeria today, because this is a case I've been following quite a lot. We've had the last 25 years, there's been a total destruction of the political activism with the dictatorship, and nothing happened. And there's been such a corruption and such a chaos that make that people today for the last 6 months have been out in the street and just asking for change, but there is still a kind of a global paranoia in the country, but who is going to be a leader? Because there's been such a destruction, and people are out. They want to do things, but it's getting very difficult to get organized in the actual Algerian system. And I think now we can see it like on a Pan-African, on a Pan-African perspective. Today, a lot of things needs to be built, because we have to be aware we are on a continent like in Africa, which is much, much easier to go from a country to another when you have a European passport than when you have an African passport. And this is very difficult with an African passport to travel in Africa. Whereas if you have a European or US passport or from the global north, you can sometimes, you don't even need a passport. With just an ID card, you can go in places. And so it means that the connection between people is still very difficult, even if you have today with the internet, things can be done to be linked. There are some things that this is the rebirth of something coming for people to try to get organized. But this is still very difficult. And I would say to link it to the past, I think today everything is done to try to make people think that the spirit of Bandung or the Tricontinental is something old-fashioned or is something that would be backwarded. Whereas I think this is really the worst nightmare of imperialism, to have people today thinking with the spirit of Bandung and the unification of the global South. And this is very important, and I think we have to turn this way rather than having some new type of 2.0 African leaders like Paul Kagame or others that are being shown like African models that are not models and just working for the imperialist future. So maybe I'm a bit pessimistic, but I think there is a lot of things to be done.
Thank you, Hassane. We just have a couple of minutes. Maybe we should wrap, unless there's absolutely something that's absolutely pressing from either of the panelists. No? Okay. Well, it gives me tremendous pleasure then to thank you, Hassane, for joining us at such an ungodly hour. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
A real pleasure. It's been a pleasure viewing the film, discussing it, thinking about it, and conversing with you. You said you're not an artist, but you truly are an artist. It's a brilliant, beautiful film. So kudos. You've really done a wonderful job. So thank you.
Thank you very much for organizing all this. Thanks a lot.
It's been a real pleasure. And I'd also like to thank our panelists, Jale, Glenn, and Zobi, for very interesting and insightful comments on the film. And of course, I'd like to thank you all for braving this cold, rainy evening, coming out and having really interesting things to say and ask of us. So thanks again for coming, and hopefully we'll see you at some subsequent events of the Institute. Have a good evening. Take care.